The wind had a cruel way of making its presence known on the high plains. It didn't simply pass through. It claimed the land, sweeping over the frozen earth until even the oldest fence posts groaned, and the strongest shutters rattled like dice in the hand of a gambler. That night in Dry Creek, the wind carried snow thick as flour sifted from heaven's hand. It piled against the fronts of buildings, buried horse troughs, and muffled the sound of boots on the boardwalk, until the town felt like it was buried alive beneath the storm. In that suffocating quiet, only the boarding house chimney gave proof that someone inside was still fighting to keep the flame alive. Behind those frosted windows, Clara Mayfield sat rigid in her chair, the fire warming her knees while the rest of her body remained stiff with caution. As if heat were some dangerous indulgence she dared not welcome too close. Her face, pale and lovely in its restraint, bore the traces of sorrow like faint scars left behind by fire. Memories burned too deep to ever vanish completely. It had been 3 years since her husband was lowered into the frozen earth on a day not unlike this one, and in that time she had made a quiet art of surviving. She kept the boarding house tidy, took in weary travelers, and pressed her lips into thin lines whenever anyone dared suggest she was still young enough to start again. But alone in the glow of the fire, when no one was watching, she sometimes let her hands rest against her chest as though to remind herself she was still made of flesh and not stone. She still dreamed, though she hated herself for it. Across the street, the saloon doors swung open against the storm. The lanterns inside flared briefly against the snow, then were swallowed in darkness as a tall figure stepped out. He moved with the measured certainty of a man who had long ago stopped doubting himself. His coat hung heavy with snow, his hat pulled low, and yet there was no mistaking the hard, angled jaw or the set of his shoulders. Silas Cain had returned to Dry Creek, though no one had expected him to walk into town during a storm that kept even the sheriff at home. Rumors about Silas had a way of growing faster than prairie fire. Some said he had once ridden with outlaws before turning his back on them. Others swore he carried debt so heavy no rancher dared trust him. And yet, for every whisper that painted him as a danger, there was another that marked him as the kind of man you wanted beside you when trouble came. He had that quiet look about him, the kind that spoke of secrets, of battles fought and won, of losses carried without complaint. Clara had known Silas long before her husband's death, though she had never spoken of it. She remembered the way he lingered at the well, the rare moments their eyes met and something unspoken passed between them. Her husband never noticed. Men rarely did. But Clara noticed, and in those moments she felt both frightened and alive, as though the earth beneath her boots might crack open if she dared step closer. The storm tried to swallow him whole as he crossed the street, snow clinging to his boots until each step was a struggle. But Silas Cain was not the kind of man who let nature or anyone decide his path. He reached the boarding house and, without hesitation, pulled open the door. The wind roared in with him, scattering ash from the fire and making Clara's skirts flutter against her legs. She stood sharply, her breath catching as a shadow stretched long across the floorboards. "You shouldn't be here," she said, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. She clutched her hands together, forcing them still as though praying that distance might turn her words into truth. Silas closed the door behind him, shutting out the storm, but not the silence. His gaze held hers, steady and unyielding, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the low thunder of a man used to being obeyed. "Storms don't ask permission, Clara," he said. "Neither do men who've waited too long." The fire popped loudly, but neither of them looked away. Clara's cheeks flushed, heat rising not just from the hearth but from the shameful recognition that she wanted to hear those words, even as she tried to bury them beneath loyalty to the dead. She opened her mouth to protest, but he crossed the floor in 2 strides, close enough that the scent of leather, horse, and snow filled the room around her. "Get your things," he whispered, each syllable falling like a brand against her skin. "You're mine now." Her heart thudded in her chest, furious at her for hesitating, furious at him for daring, furious at the world for stirring something in her that had lain quiet too long. She thought of her husband's grave, the vows she had buried alongside him, the image of herself as the untouchable widow who would never be swayed. But then she thought of the long nights, the silence of her bed, the way men's eyes in town passed over her as though she were a ghost. Silas's eyes did not pass over her. They consumed her. And yet there was danger in his words, danger she could feel crawling beneath her skin like fire beneath dry timber. Silas Cain had not come to claim her out of tenderness alone. Men like him always carried a reckoning behind them, and she knew the West did not forgive women who stepped across the lines drawn for them. Outside, the wind howled harder, rattling the shutters as if laughing at the small dramas of human hearts. It seemed to say that survival was a cruel enough game on its own, without adding love to the stakes. But Clara knew as she stood trembling in the glow of the fire, that she was already standing on the edge of a choice that would change everything. The fire burned low, as though reluctant to intrude upon the silence that had thickened between them. Clara's breath rose in uneven tremors, her eyes darting from Silas's face to the storm-slick window and back again. For years, she had managed to live on the fragile balance between grief and survival, walking a straight path where no one could accuse her of wanting more than what a widow was allowed. But now that balance had shattered. With one command, whispered in the kind of voice that could melt iron, Silas Cain had stripped away the veil she had wrapped around herself, exposing the woman beneath. Her hand lingered on the edge of the small satchel she kept tucked under her bed. Inside were the meager tokens of a life pared down to its bones. A few coins, a folded shawl, the silver locket she wore only when no one could see. She had packed and unpacked that bag 100 times in her imagination. Whenever the days grew too long, whenever she dreamed of leaving Dry Creek and the shadows it held. But she had never touched it in earnest. Never until now. Silas stood only a few feet away, and yet his presence filled the room like a storm in its own right. He did not reach for her. He did not need to. His gaze held her in place as though daring her to deny the thing they both knew had lived between them all these years. His silence was heavier than words, and it pressed against her chest until she could hardly breathe. "What you're asking," she said finally, her voice thin. "It isn't proper. People will talk." He let out a slow breath, the ghost of a smile curling beneath his mustache. "People talked before, Clara. They'll keep talking long after we're dust. I'm not asking for their blessing." He took one step closer, his boots creaking on the boards. "I'm asking for you." She wanted to protest, to list all the reasons why a respectable widow could not simply walk out into the storm with a man who carried more rumors than promises. But when she met his eyes, she saw something that terrified her more than scandal. She saw devotion, not the fleeting, polite kind she had once known, but a fierce, unrelenting hunger that spoke of years of restraint finally breaking. Before she could answer, a sound shattered the moment. A sharp rap on the boarding house door, followed by the unmistakable crunch of boots in snow. Clara stiffened. Silas's hand drifted toward the revolver at his hip, fingers brushing the worn grip with the ease of long practice. "Stay behind me," he muttered, his tone low, steady, commanding. The knock came again, harder this time, followed by a voice muffled through the storm. "Widow Mayfield, open up!" "Sheriff wants a word." Clara's stomach turned cold. She knew that voice. It belonged to Deputy Hargrove, a man who carried his authority like a cudgel, eager to make himself the law's shadow in a town already weary of watching eyes. She glanced at Silas, her pulse racing. His expression hardened, his jaw tightening as if some long-expected reckoning had finally arrived. The door rattled under another knock. "Widow, we know he's in there. Open this door or we'll break it down." Silas moved to the window, peeling back the curtain just enough to glimpse the street. In the pale glow of lanterns, he counted 3 men. 2 deputies and a stranger whose coat hung long and black, his hat pulled low. Outlaws or hired guns, Silas guessed. Their stance wasn't that of lawmen. No, this had the stink of something personal. "They aren't here for you," he whispered, turning back to Clara. "They're here for me. And if you open that door, they'll drag me out into the snow and leave you with nothing but a story the town will twist against you." Clara's knees weakened. She had not chosen this moment, yet somehow it had chosen her. The world outside demanded her silence and obedience, but the man before her demanded something else entirely. Her courage. She thought of the years she had spent carrying her husband's name like a shield, the way it had kept her safe but also caged. She thought of the lonely nights, the whispers in church, the looks from women who pitied her and men who dismissed her, and then she thought of Silas Cain, standing there with his hand near his gun, ready to fight not only for his life but for her, if she would only claim him. The knocking grew violent. "Rattling the hinges, Clara," Silas said, his voice a low growl now, urgent but tender. "This is the moment. It's them or us. Make your choice." Her heart thundered so loudly she thought the men outside might hear it. She clutched the satchel tighter, every muscle in her body trembling with the weight of decision. And in that breathless pause, as the storm clawed at the windows and the deputies shouted threats into the night, Clara Mayfield, widow, mourner, survivor, understood that the next word from her lips would either chain her to the grave she had already outlived, or free her into a future as dangerous as it was irresistible. The knock at the door became a pounding, each strike against the wood echoing like a gunshot in the narrow boarding house hall. Clara's satchel slipped from her trembling hands, the soft thud on the floor sounding louder than the storm itself. She bent quickly, clutching it close to her chest, her breath ragged as the truth settled inside her. She had chosen, not safety, not propriety, not the comfort of what little her widow's name afforded her. She had chosen him. Silas saw the decision written in her face before she could speak it aloud. His eyes softened for the briefest flicker. Though his body stayed taut as a drawn bowstring, he moved toward her swift and quiet, and with one firm hand he drew her to the rear of the house. "We're not going through the front," he whispered. "They want me dead before daylight and you branded by shame. I'll not give them either." The boarding house creaked around them as the storm's grip tightened, snow lashing against the windows in furious gusts. Clara stumbled as he guided her through the narrow kitchen, her skirts catching on chair legs, her fingers clenching the satchel until her knuckles burned white. The pounding at the door grew louder, angrier. "Widow Mayfield, open up now." Deputy Hargrove's voice carried a sharp edge, thick with authority but hollow with something else. Fear. Clara could hear it beneath his words, the kind of fear men felt when they knew they were trespassing on a ground they didn't rightly own. Silas kicked open the back door, and the storm swallowed them whole. Snow cut into Clara's face like shards of glass, the wind tearing at her bonnet until it nearly ripped free. She gasped, clutching at Silas's arm for balance, her boots sinking deep into the drift. "Keep close," he ordered, bending low against the gale. Don't look back, but Clara did look back. Through the veil of snow, she saw the lantern light spilling from her boarding house window. That small, fragile glow was all that remained of the life she had lived for years. Safe, silent, and suffocating. As the wind tore it from her sight, she felt a pang of grief as sharp as the one that had struck her the day she buried her husband. It was the grief of leaving, of burning bridges with no return. They reached the barn at the edge of town, its doors half buried beneath a snowbank. Silas shoved it open, dragging her inside. The smell of hay and horse sweat filled the space, a sharp contrast to the cold fury outside. 2 horses waited, restless and stamping, their breath rising in white plumes. Silas moved quickly, tossing a saddle over one and checking the cinch on the other. "You ever ridden in weather like this?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. Clara shook her head, her fingers trembling as she clutched the satchel. "I've barely ridden at all," she confessed, shame and fear tightening her throat. Silas glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he lifted her onto the smaller horse, his hand steady against her waist, his strength undeniable. "Then you'll ride with me," he said simply, swinging up into the saddle behind her before she could protest. The horse shifted under their weight, but Silas's grip steadied them both, his arm wrapped firm around her middle, pulling her against him, his warmth cutting through the icy layers of her clothes. For a fleeting second, Clara closed her eyes, feeling the thrum of his heartbeat against her back, the nearness of the man who had claimed her in a whisper. The barn doors burst open again, but this time not from Silas's hand. The deputies had circled quicker than he'd expected. Lantern light spilled across the straw and voices barked orders sharp as gunfire. "There! Kane's got her!" Silas spurred the horse hard, the animal leaping forward just as a shot rang out. Wood splintered above Clara's head, showering her with fragments of hay and dust. She screamed, clinging tighter to his arm as the horse barreled through the half-open door into the storm. The world became chaos, snow blinding, hooves pounding, shouts and gunfire swallowed by the howl of the wind. Clara buried her face against Silas's chest, the satchel crushed between them. Each breath she drew tasted of fear and freedom, mixed so tightly she could not tell them apart. Behind them, lanterns bobbed in the storm, chasing shadows across the white expanse. Bullets cut the night, but the storm was their ally now, wrapping them in its ruthless embrace, hiding their tracks as fast as they made them. Silas bent low over her shoulder, his lips close to her ear, his voice fierce and steady even as death followed at their heels. "Hold on, Clara. This is the beginning. No turning back now." And though terror knotted every nerve in her body, Clara felt something rise in her chest that she had not felt in years, not even at the height of her marriage, not in the security of her widow's respectability. It was wild, dangerous hope. The storm did not relent. It pursued them with the fury of a beast, howling through the canyons and across the wide plains as though intent on devouring all it touched. The snow drove against Clara's face until her skin burned, her lashes crusted with frost. She clung to Silas, every muscle trembling. Her body pressed so tightly against his she could feel the deep, steady rhythm of his heart. The horse beneath them fought the drifts, each stride a battle against nature itself. But Silas urged it onward, his voice low, calm, the kind of voice that could steady an animal even when death rode close behind. Hours passed in a blur of white and shadow. The lantern lights of Dry Creek vanished, swallowed by the storm. No gunfire followed. No voices cut the gale. Whether the deputies had given up the chase or been consumed by the blizzard themselves, Clara could not tell. All she knew was the bitter cold, the ache in her hands, and the fierce strength of the man who held her as if the storm itself might rip her from him if he loosened his grip. When at last Silas drew the horse into a sheltered hollow near the rocks, Clara could barely lift her head. The animal snorted, steam rising from its flanks, and Silas swung down, lifting her from the saddle as though she weighed nothing at all. She staggered, her knees refusing to hold her, until he caught her and guided her toward a small outcropping where the stone broke the wind's teeth. "Stay close," he murmured, his voice hoarse with the cold. "We'll make a fire. It'll be enough to see us through the night." She collapsed onto the frozen earth, her satchel still clutched to her chest like a talisman. Silas moved with quick efficiency, pulling kindling from a bundle strapped to the horse, striking flint until sparks bit into the dry twigs. It took time, too much time, but at last the flame caught, growing from a flicker into a small, determined blaze. Clara edged nearer, the heat licking her frozen fingers, tears stinging her eyes as sensation returned. For the first time since the boarding house, silence stretched between them, broken only by the storm's distant rage. Silas removed his gloves, his hands scarred and rough, veins standing like ropes beneath the skin. He fed the fire slowly, carefully, each movement revealing the discipline of a man who had made a habit of surviving when others had fallen. Clara studied him in the wavering light, every detail magnified by her exhaustion. The hard line of his jaw, the shadow of stubble along his cheeks, the hollows beneath his eyes that spoke of years gone without rest. He looked less like the whispered legend she had known from afar, and more like a man carved down to the bone by hardship. "Why me?" The words escaped her before she could stop them. Her voice was soft, raw, almost lost beneath the wind. Silas glanced at her, his expression unreadable in the shifting glow. For a long moment he did not answer. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years, he said, "Because you were the one thing I couldn't take. Not with my hands, not with my gun. You belonged to another man, and I swore I'd not cross that line. But I watched. I saw the way you lived after him. How the world turned its back on you, how you carried yourself when no one cared if you stood or fell. I've wanted you longer than I've wanted my next breath." Clara's chest tightened, torn between the ache of his words and the shame of how they stirred something deep inside her. No man had spoken to her like that. Not her husband, not anyone. Her husband had been kind, dutiful, but never burning. And now here sat a man who carried fire in his voice, a man who had waited in silence while she built her cage of mourning. She shook her head, trying to quell the storm within. "You don't know me, Silas." "Not really. You've made me into something in your mind, but the truth—" She stopped, her throat closing. He leaned closer, his eyes steady on hers. "I know enough. I know strength when I see it. I know sorrow, and I know a woman who deserves more than an empty house and whispers in church pews." The fire crackled, sending sparks into the night. Clara turned away, her face hot despite the cold. She wanted to deny him, to cling to her grief as she always had, but instead she found herself staring into the flames, imagining what it might feel like to shed that skin, to be seen not as Widow Mayfield but as Clara. The woman, not the shadow. A gust of wind tore through the hollow, scattering snow across their fire, and Silas rose, throwing his coat around her shoulders before she could protest. It smelled of horse and smoke and leather, but beneath it lingered the faintest trace of something warmer, something human. She clutched it close, her body curling into the scent as though it might protect her from the storm inside and out. The hours dragged on, the night endless. Outside the hollow, wolves howled in the distance, their cries sharp and haunting. Clara shivered, inching closer to the fire, closer to him. Silas said nothing, only watched the flames, his hand resting on the revolver at his side as though ready for the world to break in at any moment. And in that silence, Clara realized the truth. She had stepped into a life that would never again be safe, never again be simple. Every day forward would be a battle, every night a test. But as the fire warmed her face and the weight of Silas's coat held her steady, She also realized she would rather fight beside him than return to the quiet grave her life had been. The morning came without mercy. The storm had passed, but it left behind a white wilderness, endless and unforgiving. The drifts stretched out like waves frozen mid-crest, glittering under the weak light of dawn. Clara stirred beneath Silas's coat, her body stiff with cold despite the fire that had burned through the night. Her breath formed pale clouds as she sat up, the weight of her decision pressing on her chest heavier than any snow. Silas was already awake. He sat near the dying embers, his shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun broke jagged over the ridge. His revolver rested across his knee, his hand wrapped around the grip in a manner that suggested he hadn't slept, not truly. Clara studied him in the fragile light, and for the first time she saw not the outlaw whispered about in town, but a man carrying the loneliness of a lifetime, etched into every scar, every shadow. "You didn't sleep," she murmured, her voice rasping. He didn't turn. "Sleep's a luxury men like me can't afford. Not when the storm's the only thing that's covered our tracks." Her stomach nodded at the reminder. The deputies, the stranger in the black coat. Whoever had been waiting outside her door had not given up simply because the night was cruel. They would be hunting still. "They'll come," she said softly. "They won't stop until they've taken you or me." Silas finally looked at her, his eyes dark as the ironwood shadows. "Then we ride harder, farther, till the land itself hides us." "But Clara," his voice dropped low, almost reverent, "if you want to turn back, this is your last chance. Go back, say I forced you. Keep what's left of your name clean. No one would blame you." Her heart lurched. The thought of returning, of stepping back into that boarding house, of facing the whispers, the pity, the cold bed that waited, made her throat ache with a grief sharper than loss. She shook her head slowly, clutching the satchel against her chest. "I chose already," she whispered. "I won't live half dead anymore." Something unspoken passed between them then, something fiercer than words. Silas stood, his movements taut with urgency. "Eat," he said, pulling a strip of dried meat from his saddlebag and placing it in her hands. "You'll need strength. Today won't be easy." The ride began again, the horse struggling through the snow, its breath heavy in the air. Clara clung to Silas, each bump of the saddle jarring her bones. But slowly the rhythm of the ride steadied her. The land around them grew wilder, the storm's remnants carving strange, lonely shapes in the drifts. They passed abandoned homesteads, fences collapsed under the weight of snow, chimneys standing like gravestones for families who hadn't survived the winter. Clara's chest tightened at the sight. So much loss, so much survival bought with sorrow. As the sun climbed higher, Silas pulled them off the open trail and into a stand of cottonwoods where the snow thinned. He dismounted, scanning the ground, his eyes sharp, every movement deliberate. Clara slid down clumsily, nearly stumbling until his hand caught her. "Tracks," he muttered, pointing to faint impressions pressed into the snow. "Hoofprints, 6 horses at least." The storm had dulled their edges, but they were fresh enough. "They're close." Fear clutched Clara's throat. She glanced around, the silence of the trees suddenly menacing, as if eyes watched from every shadow. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice breaking. Silas's jaw tightened. "We don't run blind. They've got more men, more horses. If we keep running, they'll run us to death. We need ground where we can stand." Clara swallowed hard, clutching her satchel as though it could anchor her. She had never held a gun, never faced the thought of men hunting her like prey, yet something in Silas's steadiness steadied her in turn. She drew in a breath, her hands trembling but her voice stronger. "Then I'll stand with you." Silas's eyes flicked to her, searching, testing. For a moment he said nothing. Then a slow, grim nod bent his neck. "You've got more grit than half the men I've ridden with." They pressed on through the cottonwoods until the land broke into a shallow ravine, its rocky sides rising like walls against the wind. Silas led the horse down into the hollow, the shadows deepening as the sun slipped behind the ridge. There in the cold silence he began to prepare. He checked the cylinder of his revolver, loaded each chamber with steady hands, then handed Clara a small derringer he pulled from his coat pocket. Her breath caught as the weight of the pistol settled in her palm. "I don't know how to use this," she confessed, shame flushing her cheeks. Silas stepped close, his hands guiding hers, his voice low in her ear. "You don't need to know much. Keep it steady. Point and pull if it comes to it. Don't think, just survive." The closeness of him, the heat of his breath against her skin sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. She nodded, gripping the gun as though it could tether her to courage. Above them, a crow cawed, its cry harsh and lonely. Silas lifted his head, his jaw set like stone. They'll find us soon. Clara's heart pounded, fear and fire mingling until she could no longer tell them apart. She had left behind her old life for this, for him, for the storm, for a future that might end in blood before it ever had the chance to bloom. And as the ravine filled with silence, she understood that this was the crucible where her choice would be tested. The air in the ravine was sharp as broken glass, each breath freezing in Clara's lungs as she pressed herself against the rocks. Silas crouched low beside her, his revolver resting easy in his hand, though his eyes betrayed a quiet fury. Above them, the world held its breath, until the distant rhythm of hooves swelled into thunder. The sound grew closer, echoing down the narrow pass until it filled the hollow like a drumbeat of war. Clara's fingers tightened around the derringer, her palms slick with fear. She told herself it was only a pistol, only iron and powder, but in her hands it felt heavier than her entire life, heavier than every choice she had made. Silas's gaze never left the rim of the ravine. 6 men, maybe 7, he murmured. They'll try to pin us here. They think they've got the numbers. Clara swallowed, her throat dry as bone. Can we win? A faint smile ghosted across his lips, though it never reached his eyes. Winning ain't what this is about. It's about making them pay enough to think twice. It's about giving them something to remember. He shifted, placing himself between her and the open ground. And it's about keeping you breathing, no matter the cost. The first rider appeared on the ridge, lantern held high, his silhouette sharp against the pale sky. Then another and another, until the ravine brimmed with shadows. Deputy Hargrove's voice carried on the cold air, loud and certain. Silas Cain, you're surrounded. Hand over the widow, drop your iron, and maybe we let you live long enough to hang. Clara flinched at the words, but Silas only chuckled, low and grim. He raised his voice, each syllable carrying like thunder. Tell your sheriff he's a coward for sending dogs to do his hunting. If you want me, Hargrove, come down and take me yourself. The answer came in a hail of gunfire. Shots cracked through the air, splinters flying from the rocks as bullets tore into stone. Clara ducked, clutching the derringer to her chest, her ears ringing. Silas fired back with calm precision, each shot echoing like judgment, each bullet sending a rider scrambling for cover. The ravine became chaos. Shouts, gunfire, the panicked scream of horses. Clara pressed herself against the earth, her heart hammering, until a shadow loomed above. One of the riders had dismounted, slipping through the rocks to flank them, his face twisted with malice as he raised his rifle toward Silas's back. Silas! Clara's voice tore from her throat before she could stop it. The outlaw spun, but she was faster, or perhaps just desperate enough. She lifted the derringer, her hands shaking so violently she thought she would drop it. She pulled the trigger. The shot cracked louder than the storm, and the man collapsed into the snow, his rifle slipping from his hands. Clara froze, the pistol trembling in her grasp, smoke curling from its barrel. She stared at the body, at the crimson stain spreading across the white, and felt her breath shatter inside her chest. Silas turned, his eyes wide, not with shock, but with something fiercer, something like pride. Good girl, he rasped, his hand brushing her shoulder. You just saved my life. She wanted to weep, to scream, but there was no time. More shots rang out, one grazing Silas's arm, another tearing into the ground at her feet. He grunted, pain flashing across his face, but he stood taller, his revolver spitting fire again and again until the men on the ridge began to fall back. The battle raged until the ravine was thick with smoke and echo, until the snow was painted with blood and trampled by hooves. When the last rider fled into the distance, leaving only silence in his wake, Clara sagged against the rocks, her body trembling, her soul raw. Silas staggered, clutching his arm, blood seeping through his sleeve. Clara crawled to him, her hands frantic. You're hurt. He caught her wrist, steadying her. It's nothing, he lied, though the pallor of his face betrayed him. Don't you waste tears on me. You stood, Clara. You fought. You're not a widow anymore. You're alive. Her throat closed around the words she wanted to say, the confession that had been building since the night he whispered his claim. But before she could speak, Silas's knees buckled, and she pulled him down into the snow, cradling him against her chest. The silence of the ravine pressed heavy around them, broken only by the crackle of the dying fire and the whisper of the wind. Clara rocked him gently, her tears falling into his dark hair. Don't leave me, she begged, the words torn from her soul. Don't you dare leave me after all this. Silas's lips curved into the faintest smile, weary but unbroken. I told you, Clara, he whispered, his breath warm against her skin. Storms don't ask permission. Neither do men who've waited too long. His eyes closed, but his chest still rose, still fought. Clara held him tighter, her heart beating wild, her spirit ablaze. She looked out at the horizon, at the pale dawn breaking across the blood-stained snow, and she knew the West would not forgive them. It would test them again and again, demanding everything they had. But she also knew this. She would not go back. Not to silence, not to mourning, not to the cage she had broken. She would walk this road with him, even if it ended in ruin, because for the first time in her life, she was not merely surviving. She was choosing.